So one of the first things we see at the beginning of the Souls of Black Folk is a discussion about what he calls the color line. And DuBois says the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And what he means in sort of today modern speak is race relations. So he says everything that we are going to be concerned with over the next century and probably longer is how the races interact with each other, right? So what we call race relations today. One big idea that is really important to gather from this text is the idea of the veil. And so DuBois argues that all blacks are born with this veil, this invisible veil that separates them from whites, and separates whites from them too. And he tells this super heartbreaking story that I just get really sad every time I think about, of when he was a kid growing up in Massachusetts, and it's like a holiday and they're exchanging cards like Valentine's Day or something like that, and he's like, yeah, we were all having a ball until this one girl didn't take my card. She refused it. And, you know, and DuBois says that's the moment that I realized that I was different from other people. And so that's sort of when he comes to recognize the veil. And it's at a super young age when he experiences feeling different for the first time from this bitchy girl who doesn't want to take his little card. And this is something that African Americans really have to overcome. He says, you know, after I realized that it was there, I didn't have any desire to tear it down. I held all beyond it in common contempt and lived above it in a region of blue sky and great wandering shadows. So this veil, this invisible barrier that exists for the African American, what it does is it creates a lack of communication between whites and blacks. That snowballs into this inability to understand the world of the other person, right? Because if I can't communicate you, I don't get it. I don't understand your universe. And if I don't understand your universe, then I dehumanize you. And that dehumanization is what breeds prejudice and violence. You'll see him talk about the color line and the veil kind of interchangeably sometimes. And that's you know, just something I wanted to clue you into, but what the veil and the color line create within the mind of the African American is what DuBois calls the double consciousness. And so he tells us right away on page 2, the Negro is the seventh son born with a veil and gifted with the second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. The idea of a double consciousness is that the African American can never see himself as he truly is, because he's always has to look at himself through the eyes of the white person, because that's the way he's viewed in society. And he has a double consciousness because he can never just be himself. He's always two things. He's always an American and black, right? He's always a black man. He's never just a man. He's never just a human. So he says, one ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. I think there's a really cool connection that can be made between the veil that DuBois talks about and the prologue to a book by Ralph Ellison called Invisible Man. There's also a really cool connection between Invisible Man and Notes from Underground. So I just wanted to sort of point out a passage to you. This is from the prologue of Ellison's novel, and it says, I'm an invisible man. I'm not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, and I'm not one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids. I might even be said to possess a mind, but I am invisible because people refuse to see me. It's so as I've been surrounded by mirrors of hard distorting glass. When people approach me, they see only my surroundings themselves or figments of their imagination. The invisible man is black, right? He's black in America, in a world that refuses to acknowledge his existence as a human. And he says, my invisibility is not just because of my skin color. The invisibility to which I refer occurs because of a peculiar disposition of the eyes of those with whom I come in contact, a matter of the construction of the inner eyes, those eyes with which they look through their physical eyes upon reality. So that's the veil. That's the double consciousness coming through. So how do we get over this? How does the African American sort of transcend beyond the veil? The first thing you have to do is recognize that it exists and try to unite the two selves together. And you do that through self-assessment and self-analysis to develop an identity. So he tells us on page 5 that it changed the child of emancipation to the youth with a dawning self-consciousness, self-realization, and self-respect. In those somber forests of his striving, his own soul rose before him, and he saw himself darkly as through a veil. But yet he saw in himself some faint revelation of his power, of his mission. He began to have a dim feeling that, to attain his place in the world, he must be himself and not another. Another example I wanted to draw your attention to here is the Clark doll experiment. So if you've taken a social class, you might have heard about this. But Kenneth and Mamie Clark did a set of experiments and published some papers in 1939 and 1940 that will eventually become used in the Brown versus the Board of Education case. And they're looking at the differences between the way that Black children perceive themselves if they attend segregated schools in DC or they attend integrated schools in New York City. And what the Clarks found is that segregated Black children had this distorted perception of self. They preferred to play with white dolls over black. If you drew an outline of a human figure and asked them to fill it in with the color of their skin, they always chose a color that was lighter than their actual skin color. And if you asked them to take two dolls and say, well, which one did you want to play with? They picked the white doll. And they said the white doll was pretty. It was nice. The black doll was bad. It was ugly. And so the Clarks saw this as evidence that kids internalize racism. And because they were discriminated against and stigmatized by segregation, they had this distorted self-perception. That's also the double consciousness. So, Invisible Man and the Clark doll experiment are, I think, two really good examples of how we can sort of understand what DuBois means by the double consciousness. Another important part of this text is education. So, we talked about Washington earlier. DuBois wants higher education for African Americans. He says they've got to go to college, but he knows that it's not realistic to send everyone to college, so he thinks what he really advocates for is what he calls the talented 10. So the top 10% of African Americans will sort of shoulder the burden and lead everyone else into a successful future. What I really take him to be saying here is that the Black community needs leadership, and they don't have it. And so they need the best and the brightest to sort of lead the rest of them into this bright and successful future. So higher education, the purpose of it is to create humans, right? To teach African Americans how to be human after spending so long being treated as animals. He has this quote that I love on 52 where he talks about the function of college. And he says, the function of the university is not simply to teach breadwinning or to furnish teachers. It is to be the organ of that fine adjustment between real life and the growing knowledge of life, an adjustment which forms the secret of civilization. So higher education is the key to transforming African Americans from slaves into humans. So when we're sending people to college, we're not training people to be brick masons or psychologists. We're training them to be human. So, a couple of other things to understand about the text. DuBois, on the one hand, we've talked a lot about progress and whether it's good or bad. You would think that DuBois would be pro-progress, and he is, for the most part. He recognizes that, we've come a long way, and African Americans in 1903 are better off than they were 100 years before that. But he's also really worried about the future because he sees people showing these attitudes where they care more about money and wealth, and they're kind of shedding their traditional ideals and morals and values, and he thinks that that's not, that's just kind of an unfortunate casualty of progress. He says the habit is forming of interpreting the world in dollars, and he says, the old leaders of Negro opinion are being replaced by these people who only care about money. And then when he talks about the transformation of a far-off ideal of freedom into the hard reality of breadwinning and the consequent deification of bread, he's talking about turning money into a god. People are taking Booker T. Washington too seriously, and they're focusing too much on money. And that's what DuBois says is really dangerous. He talks about going back to Tennessee and visiting the place where his schoolhouse used to be, and it's gone. And what's in its place? Progress. He says progress is necessarily ugly. So that notion of progress that he sees in chapter 4 is really important. One of the last things I want to say is DuBois has some views about religion, which are going to be kind of important because we'll talk a lot about religion in the last couple of texts we deal with. So you can see in chapter 10 where he talks about the function that religion, the church has served for the African American community. It's given them strength, camaraderie, it's given them a sense of freedom, but on the other hand, he says it also maintains the status quo of oppression. We talked about Marx last week, right? And one thing to understand is that DuBois actually becomes really sympathetic to Marxism at the end of his life. He sees that people of color have enjoyed a lot of freedom under communist China and Soviet Russia. But the sort of sad ending to all of this is that DuBois basically gives up, At the end of his life, he's like, I don't think we're ever going to achieve equality. And so he moves to Ghana and becomes this champion of Pan-Africanism. So a lot of great and important things in this text. The big ideas you want to understand, obviously, are the veil, the double consciousness, the difference between DuBois and Washington and stuff like that. But I have some really cool videos for you to watch for the voice thread for this week, so make sure you watch them and comment on some of the discussion questions.